okay, so we're talking about the person, the PRRC person responsible for regulatory compliance with you and jury. So Anne, I think just as a big, just to get started, I think, and to get underway, could you summarize or tell us a little bit more about this role that people are having to embark on? Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yes, the PRRC is the person responsible for regulatory compliance, and it's a requirement brought out in, if you want to bother to look, Article 15 in both the medical device regulations and the IVD regulations. So the idea is that a named person or persons, it can be more than one, has to be identified within the organization to be responsible for 5 specific activities, and the article outlines what they are. You have to have certain qualifications and experience to be allowed to be appointed into such a role, and everybody has to have one. All manufacturers, regardless of where they're located, so that could be anywhere in the world if you want to supply it to the European Union. And it also applies to authorized representatives based in the EU, acting on behalf of manufacturers. And it can apply even to companies such as distributors and importers if they carry out activities that make them look like manufacturers. So if they change the labeling or translate instructions for use, or generally mess about with the packaged entity after it's been placed on the market, they also have to appoint a PRRC. So the requirement is huge and is affecting a lot of people, a lot of companies.
Building from that answer, then, what are the sort of exact requirements? What are those requirements in that EU legislation?
So, well, first of all, then let's talk about the qualifications, because whilst companies, most medical device companies, whatever type of economic operator they are, have had regulatory staff of some sort. So this isn't requiring companies to do anything they weren't doing before, but what it does do is formalize that someone has to take responsibility for ensuring that certain things happen. And that qualification requirement requires you to have a diploma or certificate or equivalent qualification in a number of listed disciplines, including things like law, medicine, life sciences, plus 1 year of relevant experience in medical devices regulatory affairs. Okay, this is not an exact quote, but that's what you're required to have. If you haven't got a qualification like that, you can substitute all of that with 4 years or more of relevant regulatory experience. So that's the sort of kind of candidate that you need to have. And of course, not every company has got someone with that level of experience in the organization. So small and micro organizations are allowed to outsource for that experience. So that's the qualifications. Do you want to talk about the responsibilities, what they actually have to do?
Yeah, I think building on that, then, yeah, what does this role entail? What does the EU expect of this person when they are nominated or volunteer for this particular role?
Right. Well, this is it. So although I've alluded to the fact that regulatory people have always had to do these things, this requirement is significant in that this person is taking on the kind of public face of compliance for the company, and that's, I'm not saying that lightly, because they do actually have to have their name and contact details entered into the public portion of UDAMED when it's working, and in fact that module is open now. So the responsibilities are specifically laid out in 5 bullet points in Article 15, paragraph 3. And they cover things like the release of each batch of devices. Now, this is, the PRRC has to ensure that these activities happen. They don't necessarily have to do it themselves. So yes, they have to make sure that each batch of devices in production conforms with the quality system requirements. So that's one. They have to ensure that the technical documentation and the declaration of conformity is drawn up. And thirdly, they have to ensure that the manufacturer's post-market surveillance obligations are met, and also that their vigilance obligations, so that's the serious adverse event reporting obligations, are fulfilled. The fifth one is a bit odd because it's ensuring that the statement of compliance with the general safety and performance requirements is met for all investigational devices or performance evaluation devices for IVDs. And that means that's the only time that this person really has to be involved pre-placing on the market, so pre-CE marking. And making sure that the technical file is drawn up, of course, that needs to come before placing on the market as well. But those 5 distinct disciplines, as I say, are things that regulatory affairs people should know about. But now to be responsible for it is raising a lot of questions about, well, how do we actually go about doing that? What evidence do we create to show that we've done it? Especially if we're maybe one of several PRRCs and the job is shared between various people.
I think the next question then, building on from that, would be, it sounds like it's a significant responsibility for someone to have. What does it mean if things go wrong, and this person's name is, I suppose we don't know until things do, but I suppose materializes. But yeah, is there any idea of what might happen?
Yeah, well, that I suppose is where most people are at. So in terms of thinking what this role entails, and that's a really good point. I went in my previous answer slightly into my presentation mode because I now know this article off by heart, which is a bit dull. But the question of liability is the one that's really getting everyone talking. So if I take this role on, if my boss asks me to become a PRRC, what am I taking on? And there's several aspects to this, and we could discuss this till forever. But the things to really take note of are the fact that enforcement penalties are laid down by each member state's own competent authority. So they have their own law in each member state in the EU. So it may vary. So that's the first thing. So first of all, you need to know when you're taking on this role, under what kind of legal jurisdiction are you taking it on? And what have they said specifically about enforcement of this particular article? Now, most countries do not specify to that level of detail. They just talk about meeting the requirements of the regulations, making sure that devices are safe and perform as intended, which is, when all said and done, the responsibility of the manufacturer overall. That's not what the PRRC is doing. They are not wholesale responsible for the safety of devices, but the PRRC is like a kind of, well, I hesitate to say it, but like an internal inspector. So they do an extra level of checking. They go through and make sure that everything is documented in the quality system to enable all these things to happen, and then to check that they are happening on an ongoing basis. So yeah, it's going to be a role where you need to know all aspects of the medical device regulations that pertain to those things. And those 5 bullet points that I mentioned cover an awful lot of detail in the regs. So yeah, getting up to speed and keeping up to speed, maintaining your competence in these areas is going to be the key issue for people who are appointed as PRRC.
I'm just going back to one of the other, just to go back to an earlier point actually that you mentioned. It refers quite often to relevant experience. What is relevant experience? What does that mean? How is it defined?
Well, this is the tricky one, isn't it? So yeah, I've been working as a consultant in medical device regulatory affairs for, well, let's just say decades. And it occurs to me I have had my own business now for 20 years. How do I show my clients that I'm competent to advise them? That's been an issue for me for some time, because I'm no longer an employee working within an organization like a notified body, where I used to work within the notified bodies. They have very, very good structured training programs and tracking of qualifications, etc. So it's the same for anybody within an organization. If you're one person, especially in the smaller organizations where you are solely the only person who knows the regulations and all the guidance and so on, then you have to design your own program of education, really. So attending conferences, webinars, reading articles is the way that we have to manage our knowledge and competence and keep up to speed. So I think more than ever, my expectation is that the PRRCs, when a notified body comes into audit, for example, they're going to say, what do you do to maintain your competence? It will force it to become a kind of profession over time, I think, like others, like lawyers, medics, like the QP in the pharmaceutical industry, where they have a continuing professional development program to maintain qualification as a QP. So I can see it going down that road eventually.
And yeah, I was going to say, it would then be sort of you need so many hours of development or CPD points of some sort. And I was actually thinking, this role does seem to draw similarities with a QP in the pharma industry, and I suppose there are similarities there. I suppose it's a layer of responsibility and for quality purposes and safety purposes.
Yeah. In the first draft, well, not the first, but one of the drafts of the new medical device regulation before it was published, it was called the qualified person. And then they changed it between the last draft and publication, it changed to the person responsible for regulatory compliance. And I can only assume that is because it is slightly different. It's not exactly the same. So they didn't want there to be confusion.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So the responsibilities are slightly different. I mean, the batch release thing, that's a very much a QP kind of activity. But yeah, the idea of, tracking your hours, continuing professional development, even if it's not a requirement at the moment, I think it makes good sense. It's a kind of best practice way to go about this. So I would strongly advise anybody looking at this to be thinking in terms of not only do I qualify according to the requirements that I mentioned, but how do I demonstrate maintenance of that whole kind of experience thing.
I think that's what I was actually just about to ask next, I suppose, is, what can someone do to prepare for this if they are being nominated in this role or thinking of, becoming, taking on this responsibility? What can someone do and plan in preparation?
Yeah, I think if particularly if you feel like your experience or your qualifications are a bit borderline, then it would be a good idea to find some training. And now, of course, we're talking on a training platform here, so that's an obvious way to go, is to look for courses that will bolster your experience, but particularly if you have gaps in your knowledge or your experience. So I think the regulation actually says you need experience in quality assurance or regulatory affairs. So, it's quite possible that you've just been working, I say just, but your experience has been working purely in the quality assurance side, implementing standards like 13485, and that you don't have a lot of regulatory experience. So go out there maybe and look for training that will help you fill the specific gaps. Maybe if you are in regulatory, but you've never had any involvement in post-market surveillance, then look for a course on that to start plugging the gaps. I mean, there is nowhere any definition of what a regulatory affairs professional should or shouldn't know in the medical device industry.
And it's different in every company as well, isn't it? I suppose, yeah.
Absolutely. So, your experience, you may have had years of experience, but if it was just for in one product in a small company which has been on market for years, that's not going to be the same as 1 year of experience within a large medical device company with maybe hundreds of different product families, and an exposure to a lot of different sort of disciplines. So it's not just about time in the job, you know, it's about breadth of experience as well. So different devices. And another question which keeps cropping up is, oh, you know, I've got experience in software. Can I be the PRRC for an implant company? Oh, you know, I don't know. I think at this time we have to see how this pans out. And, you know, there's a shortage of regulatory people, more and more. You know, the notified bodies are recruiting heavily. The industry itself, I know I work with a number of small startup companies, and they really struggle to find permanent staff to, you know, to carry on from where I've helped them to get to. So yeah, I think training and education is increasingly important in this sector going forward.
So yeah, how does Brexit impact this particular role, depending if you're EU side or UK side?
Well, now that the UK has exited from the EU, our status in regard to the PRRC is the same as any other country in the world outside of the EU. So we don't have any special requirement here. I suppose it's worthy of note that obviously if you're UK based and supplying to the EU, you still need to have a PRRC like every other manufacturer. But if you're only supplying in the UK or other regions that are not EU, then you don't need a PRRC per se at the moment. But that's only because our present regulation in the UK is still based on the old directives where there was no requirement for PRRC. However, the Department of Health are busy preparing a big amendment to that pre-existing UK regulation. And the drafts would indicate that they are closely following a lot of the medical device regulation and IVD regulation. So it's likely that there will be a similar kind of a role required. So that, you know, whether you are just UK or not, you perhaps should still be thinking about the competence of your regulatory advice, whether that's an internal employee or an external consultant, etc. Still think, you know, you'd be well advised to look to the future and expect something like this to be required. But we shall see.